This is an excerpt from The Drum, A History by Matt Dean. Follow the links below to find out more or to purchase the book. The history of drum machines, samplers and electronic drums. The drum is a beautifully organic and natural instrument that allows us to connect with the earth, our gods, our primeval past, our inner consciousness, or whatever else the player allows themselves to experience. It is ancient and natural, made from the trees of our forests and the bodies of our animals. This deep connection with the natural world and our civilization's history is one of the attractions of the drum. Another is the instant connection with the sound that is produced. The close contact with the instrument when struck and the sound that is then created means that the vibration is felt as much as it is heard. Drummers can feel and enjoy the impact upon the animal skin, the whoosh of air that is moved behind the skin, and the reverberations around the shell of the instrument. It is therefore a slow and confusing process for some drummers when they are faced with the significant rise of electronics in the drumming market. While some may scratch their heads, unsure whether to embrace technology or run for the sanctuary of their treehouse and frame drum, others push hard to discover what these futuristic gadgets can offer the drummer. In the 1970s, synthesizers were gaining increasing respect and enjoying wide use throughout the music industry as the new, modern sound of music. The greatest use of these synthesizers was keyboard instruments, which are ubiquitous today across a majority of musical styles. However, in 1971, Graham Edge from the band Moody Blues and Brian Groves, a professor from Sussex University, designed one of the first incarnations of the electronic drum kit. It consisted of rubber trigger pads that had a layer of silver paper on the back. Attached to this was a magnet which housed a silver cord that moved up and down to create an electronic signal. It utilised sounds to create 10 tom-toms, 8 bass drums, 5 snare drums and 16 sequencers. It was a temperamental mass of transistors and wiring that was not robust enough to sell commercially, but it did warrant its place in history when it was used on the track Procession from the 1971 Moody Blues album Every Good Boy Deserves Favour. 2 years later, a Moog 1130 percussion controller had been released. It was not an electronic drum per se, but a trigger that worked as an alternative to a keyboard. It consisted of a single-headed Ludwig drum casing with the Moog electronics housed inside the shell. 2 voltage output controls were positioned on the side, one for volume and one for pitch. The intention was to use it in conjunction with equipment such as a Moog modular synthesizer. This was often a huge modular monophonic analog synthesizer consisting of numerous buttons and patch cables like a telephone operator's switchboard, which could be moved around to alternate the sounds. The percussion controller was simply a device that controlled the signal sent to the synthesizer to trigger a sound. The progressive and groundbreaking drummer Cole Palmer was involved in the early stages of drum sequencing. For the track Toccata from the 1973 Brain Salad Surgery album, Palmer used a drum kit to control synthesized sounds during his drum solo. The kit was made of stainless steel with engravings on the shell and set upon a revolving drum riser. Framed by 2 huge gongs and chime bars, Palmer would solo with a mix of rock drums and orchestral percussion. It was only when he introduced the cutting-edge modern electronics that he really broke new ground. The shells of the toms were rigged to trigger preset drum sequences, whether it was a synthesized arpeggio or spaceship-type whooshes and screeches. Then in 1976, the electronic drum market really opened up when the first commercial electronic drum was released by Pollard Industries under the name of Syndrum. Joe Pollard and Mark Burton created this simple drum brain and released it with accompanying pads before it was bought out by Research Development Incorporated, who delivered the Syndrum 1, Syndrum Twin Drum and Syndrum Quad, each allowing a different number of pads with a Kevlar Duraline head as the playing surface. The technology was basic, with a waveform generator using filters to manipulate the sounds to achieve a sound that wasn't all that close to a drum. The laborious task of turning dials to find a suitable sound was alleviated slightly by the instruction manual that offered setting diagrams of popular noises. A budget model was also produced, called the Syndrum CSM, which housed the module inside the shell and sacrificed some of the sound altering abilities. Big drumming names such as Jeff Porcaro, Terry Bozzio and Keith Moon were associated with this cutting-edge drum equipment. Another early user was Michael Shreve, who first came to prominence aged 19 following his drum solo at the Woodstock Festival in 1969 while playing for Santana. Experimenting with electronics since the early days of 1973, he was a user of Syndrum and of instruments made by Impact Percussion in Portland, Oregon. These were used in 1976 on a self-titled debut album of Shreve's side project, Automatic Man. Furthermore, in 1989, Shreve recorded an album with David Beale titled The Big Picture, in which he used electronic percussion exclusively, such as the Cat trigger pads. A year after Syndrum, the Synair was released by Star Instruments as a self-contained unit with the pads built onto the edge of the module. It was similar to the Syndrum, but also allowed for a ring modulator, a sequencer, and pink noise effects. It was very close to a keyboard synthesizer, with melodic sounds that could be played across the 4 pads, with 12 zones in total. Star Instruments released the Synair 2 and then the budget Synair 3, which, like the Syndrum CSM, was housed within the UFO-shaped shell. Syndrum and Synair soon fell out of favour, but the electronic revolution wasn't over yet. It wasn't just electronic instrument companies that saw the potential of this market. Japanese acoustic drum manufacturer Pearl wanted a piece of the action too. In 1979, they released the SY1 Syncussion unit, consisting of 2 separate channels, each with an oscillator that could produce basic waveforms, which could then be modified with an LFO, noise generator, or envelope generator. They were used in conjunction with 2 drums fitted with transducers, and then placed around an acoustic drum kit to be used as an extra utility to the available traditional drum kit timbrels. The unit was quickly picked up and used on a few unfavourable disco records, and then had trouble disassociating itself from these tracks. It ultimately never achieved the sales that it might otherwise have achieved. Another company working along the same line was Electro-Harmonix, who produced a space drum in the late 1970s. This small box had one playing surface and control knobs to alter the frequency of the produced note. However, with sounds bearing more similarity to a fictional spaceship laser gun than a drum, it never really threatened the acoustic drum too severely. Many companies saw the potential here, but had only managed a novelty auxiliary instrument to use alongside an acoustic kit. No one had yet produced a usable electronic drum kit to stand alone, that is, until Simmons arrived at the dawn of the 1980s. Founded in 1978, the English company had designed the SDS-3 with round, real drum heads set on wooden shells, which were built by Premier. It had a brain with a noise generator and either 2 or 4 drum channels. These early models were experimented with, but were really only part of the journey towards the big product. Simmons focused on the belief that a drum sound consisted of both a pitched and an unpitched sound. The pitched tone of the drum was to be tuned separately to the unpitched noise element, and a unique sound was achieved that the other manufacturers had failed to create. With this in mind, and help from Richard Burgess, the drummer from the jazz fusion band Landscape, the SDS-V, or SDS-5, was released in 1981, and the world's first completely electronic drum kit had arrived. A revolution had now truly begun, and drumming would never be the same again. It has since become an icon of the 1980s, with the hexagonal pads, which came as a snare drum, bass drum, and 3 toms. It featured a rack-mountable brain, which created the very distinctive and well-used sound that epitomised. This was an excerpt taken from a book which covers the subject in far greater detail. The Drum, A History by Matt Dean, published by Scarecrow Press, is a comprehensive study into the history of the drum from the earliest evidence, looking deep into every culture across the world to chart the migration of the drums we know today and how religion, mythology, politics, communication, military use, survival, technology and fashions affected this evolution. This reference book seeks to answer many of the questions as to how the drum became the powerful and emotive instrument that we enjoy today. Follow the links below to find out more or to purchase the book.